From waking up at your own funeral to voluntarily spending a night in a coffin.
Here are 10 chilling stories of people being buried alive.
Chinese woman climbs out of coffin 6 days after her death. A 95-year-old Chinese woman terrified neighbors by climbing out of her coffin 6 days after she supposedly died. Her neighbor found her unconscious and not breathing in her bed more than a day after falling and injuring her head. She was kept in a coffin in her neighbor's house, but one day before the funeral she was found back in her kitchen cooking.
Mr. Cornish. There was a premature burial involving a man named Mr. Cornish. He apparently died of a fever. The customary thing at the time was to bury the body fairly quickly after the pronounced death. The gravedigger was halfway done with his work when he paused to chat with some bypassers. While they were chatting, they heard moans coming from the half-buried grave. They realized that he had been buried alive and hurried to dig him out before he would run out of oxygen. Unfortunately, it was too late. Mr. Cornish had suffocated in his own grave, with his knees and elbows bloodied and beaten. Mr. Cornish's half-sister was so terrified by the event that she told her relatives to behead her when she was thought to be dead, to avoid the same fate.
Boy wakes up at his own funeral and asks for a glass of water. A boy that was declared dead sat up in his coffin just before his funeral and asked for a glass of water. He apparently smiled, looked around and drank his water and then climbed back in his coffin. He then lied back down in the coffin dead. His dad could not wake him up and carried him to a hospital. Doctors were mystified as to what happened and confirmed he was indeed dead.
Mrs. Bolger. A farmer's wife named Mrs. Bolger suddenly died of unknown causes. Doctors confirmed her death and she was quickly buried. Sometime after her death, the farmer found out that his wife had previously suffered from hysteria and that there was a possibility that she didn't actually die. The farmer became hysterical and proceeded to exhume her body for confirmation of her fate. Shockingly, he found his wife's body turned over, with her clothes shredded to pieces, and the glass of the coffin lid was shattered all over her. She was bloody and her fingers were missing entirely. No one knows what the farmer did after the horrific discovery.
Sipho William Matlacha. In 1993, a South African man named Sipho William Matlacha and his fiancée was in a severe car accident. Sipho survived but was so badly injured that he was declared dead by the accident. Sipho's body was taken to the mortuary and placed in a metal box for burial. But amazingly, Sipho was never in fact dead. He had only become unconscious in the crash. For 2 days and nights he remained in the metal box until he awoke and began to scream for help. By chance, someone of the workers were around to relieve him out of the box, and he survived the whole ordeal. The unfortunate part of the story came when Sipho tried to return home to his fiancée, only to be sent away because she thought he was a zombie. As if being buried alive wasn't bad enough.
Mina Al Lawati. A 25-year-old woman named Mina Al Lawati had been chatting with a man online for a while and decided to make a trip abroad to meet him for real. She met the man and they had a nice evening. That was until she collapsed on the floor in the middle of the conversation. Instead of calling for help, the man assumed her to be dead and made a spontaneous decision to bury her in his garden. But as it turned out, she wasn't actually dead. Apparently, she was an undiagnosed diabetic and fell into a diabetic coma before she was buried alive. After a few days, her family reported her missing and traveled to try to find her. Later, the man confessed and was charged with manslaughter after the police had finally tracked her murderer down and raided his home, where they found his muddy clothes and a used shovel.
Lawrence Cawthorne. This is a dreadful story of early burial which is more of a legend. A butcher named Lawrence Cawthorne fell ill in 1661. His landlady could inherit his belongings and so was excited and eager for his swift death. So she saw to it that he was declared dead without a doctor's consultation and buried at a nearby chapel. Not long after his sudden death, visitors and mourners heard screams coming from the grave. They hurried to dig him up, but it was too late. Cawthorne's shroud was totally shredded. His head was bloodied and the eyes were swollen and beyond recognition from where he'd beaten his head against the coffin in an attempt to break out. His landlady was then accused of prematurely putting him in his grave, and this story became a legend for hundreds of years.
Octavia Smith Hatcher. A woman that lost her child went into a deep depression where she gradually became sick and slipped into a coma. Later that year, she was pronounced dead of unknown causes, still in her bed. She was buried very quickly in the local cemetery due to the heat. Less than a week later, many others had been getting the same illness, and they too fallen into a comatose state. The thing is that after some time, the other affected people began to wake up. The woman's husband feared that his wife has been prematurely buried. He decided to dig her up, only to find that his fears were indeed grounded in reality. The lining inside the coffin had been scratched and shredded. Her nails were bloodied and broken, and her face was contorted with horror. She had died a gruesome death after being buried alive. Her husband had a lifelike monument made by her grave, a monument that still stands today.
Buried alive voluntarily. People have gone so far as to be voluntarily buried alive to try and escape death. For as long as we know, there have been cases of those trying to defy fate. A 35-year-old Russian man did that, only to succumb to a tragic death. With the help from his friend, they dug and inserted the coffin with air piping, a bottle of water and a cell phone. For some wild reason, the man burying himself believed that being buried alive for 24 hours would make him lucky and happy forevermore for the rest of his life. The man called his friend once to tell him he was fine, but when the friend returned to retrieve him the next morning, he was dead. The overnight rain might have clogged the air pipes and caused the man to suffocate in his casket. Even though this story is extremely tragic, the even more alarming and disturbing thing is that being buried alive was a popular internet trend in Russia at the time, so nobody knows how many have endured the same gruesome fate.
The 6-year-old who survived. The idea of being buried alive is scary enough, but it becomes inconceivably horrific when a child is the victim of such a catastrophe. But that is what happened to a 6-year-old girl in India. Apparently, a couple that lived close to the victim told her that her mother wanted them to accompany her to a fair. The couple took the girl to a sugarcane field and proceeded to strangle her and bury her for an unknown reason. Luckily, some of the villagers working in the fields saw them enter and became suspicious when they exited without the child. They searched and found her unconscious, not breathing, in a shallow grave in the field. They rushed her to the hospital just in time, and although the girl did not remember being buried alive, she was still able to identify her kidnappers. No one knows why the couple planned to kill the girl, and they are apparently still out there.
And that's it for this countdown. Thanks for burying with us.